The Israelis aren't sure what they're going to do, but there's a lot of genocidal language coming out of Damascus. They say we're going to grind the Israeli settlements into dust and we're going to pave the roads with Jewish skulls.
I mean, the elephant in the room talking about the war is the status of the Palestinians. Chris made good points about what could have happened to the Jewish state. The question is, what's happening to the Palestinians? Interestingly, the result of Nasser's humiliation, the defeat in the '67 war, is a big boost in Palestinian nationalism, which of course is not what the Israelis want.
And then it becomes who can get to the canal quickest before the Israelis get us.
But they get to the Suez Canal remarkably quickly.
Well, remember, it's about 80 miles. It's basically the distance between London and Cardiff. And so you're basically going down the M4 across a desert.
Well, at one point also about Pearl Harbor. I mean, it's interesting that the Israelis coordinate the airstrike with then a devastating ground strike.
Yes.
Whereas the problem with Pearl Harbor is that the Japanese have a devastating airstrike and they still lose because they miss the aircraft carriers, they miss the fact that America can outproduce them. So this is an example in sort of military terms of how to do an operation to achieve a victory very, very quickly.
I think it would have been very difficult to eradicate the idea of Israel, the homeland for the Jews. And I think, as we said, I think the Americans would have come in very early.
In the long and tumultuous history of the Middle East, one of the most spectacular turning points happened in the space of less than a week. The Six-Day War of 1967 was an historic victory for the State of Israel. Surrounded by hostile neighbours, the Israelis launched a preemptive strike and routed the combined forces of Egypt, Jordan and Syria, seizing vast territories including the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank and the Golan Heights. The impact on the Middle East and the wider world was profound and continues to be felt to this very day. It was a stunning victory for Israel and its military. But it was also the moment the country expanded decisively beyond its original borders, increasing yet further the hostilities felt towards Israel by its Arab neighbours. I'm James Hanson and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Each week we focus on a different battle or military campaign, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today it's the Six-Day War, a lightning conflict that changed the Middle East forever. But what if the battle had played out differently? What if the Arab coalition had struck first, or their forces had been better prepared? What if Israel's bold tactics had failed? Would the country look the same as it does today, or would it even exist at all? Those are just some of the questions we'll be asking our experts, and joining me today, as ever, is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, and making his debut on History Undone, we're delighted to be joined by Matthew Hughes, Professor of Military History at Brunel University. Welcome to you both. Now, before we get into the events of the battle itself, or the Six-Day War itself, let's just talk about the state of the region in 1967. Israel is here on the map, and the first thing to say about Israel in 1967, pre the Six-Day War, is of course it has far less territory than it does after the war. In fact, at its narrowest, it's only 12 miles wide, and that informs the insecurity that many Israelis feel at the time. Adding to that is the fact that it's got neighbours around it that are all very hostile. None of them recognise the State of Israel, having been founded in 1948. You've got Egypt under Nasser, who control the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip, which is this tiny, tiny stretch of land on this map here. We'll zoom in on it in due course. You've got Jordan under King Hussein. Also, they do not recognise the State of Israel, and they control the West Bank and East Jerusalem at the time. You've got Syria up here. They've got control of the Golan Heights. And the other thing to note at this point, of course, today we think of Israel's main regional enemy being Iran. Iran is a very different country at this point because, of course, we're more than 10 years out from the Iranian Revolution, and so it's still under the control of the Shah. So that is the context of the region at the time. Matthew Hughes, to bring you in, welcome to the channel, first of all.
Hi, James.
Just give us a sense of the 20 years preceding this, from the founding of the State of Israel in 1948 up to the Six-Day War. What has happened in that window?
Well, it's interesting, James, because the SixDay War is the third of a whole series of wars that the State of Israel has with its Arab neighbours in various different configurations, also with the Palestinians inside of Israel and more recently with Hezbollah and in the Gaza Strip today. But in 1948, Israel is born in the middle of a war. What for the Israelis is the Israeli War of Independence. It starts in 1947, maybe even 1946. It runs through to 1949. What for the Palestinians is al-Nakba, the catastrophe. So you have an initial war in which Israel is formed, and it's formed within the boundaries that you've just laid out to the viewers, minus the West Bank, minus the Golan Heights, minus the Gaza Strip, minus Sinai. And in 1956, there is a second war between Israel and Egypt, what's known as the Suez Crisis, which draws in Britain and France, and British and French troops land at Port Said in the north and push down the Suez Canal. And Egypt emerges from the 1956 war militarily defeated, but politically triumphant, in its leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, is seen to be a great figurehead for Pan-Arabism and for Arab and Egyptian resistance to Israel and the formation of this Jewish state in the Middle East. So the result of the 56 war is, in fact, the Israelis capture the Sinai Peninsula, so they push their forces through to the Suez Canal. There's a dramatic paratrooper drop in the Mitla Pass, and the Israelis then, in 1957, pull out from the Sinai, and the United Nations sends a force in called UNEF, the United Nations Emergency Force, and UNEF, which is made up of various forces drawn in from the United Nations, acts as a sort of a buffer force between Egypt and Israel. So the situation in 1967, in May, June, before the war starts, is that you have a United Nations force as a buffer force in the Sinai Peninsula. Eventually it's going to be withdrawn, and in June 1967 we then have the third of a series of the Arab-Israeli wars, and in this one the Jordanians and the Syrians are also drawn in, and it is perhaps the war which has the most dramatic impact in terms of territorial change and the conflict that we see today coming forward from this 1967 war to what happens today.
And Chris, one thing we should probably say as well is, look, this is 1967,
Yep.
and so this is the middle of the Cold War, and that feeds into this because you've got the Americans preoccupied in Vietnam, you've got the Soviet Union who are allied with the Arab states, so that is crucial context that we need to remember here.
Absolutely, and it's a real cockpit for superpower conflict and even proxy action. I mean, what precipitates the war, essentially, is there's an ongoing guerrilla campaign on the borders of Israel that comes to a head, really, in early 1967, where you're getting raids across the border from Syria, and there's an artillery engagement as well from Syria in April 1967. And in the end, 6 Syrian jets get shot down by the Israelis. There's damage across the border. There are all sorts of rumours that the Israelis are going to do something at the time. But what really precipitates the action is the fact that the Soviet Union says to the Egyptians, who then relay it to their allies in Jordan, Iraq and Syria, that the Israelis are going to use a summer exercise in Galilee to actually attack Syria. So from April onwards, there's increasing tension because of this, the shoot down of the jets, but also this idea that maybe Israel is going to attack Syria. Now, as Matthew said, what happens then is that in May, on the 16th of May, Nasser says, right, I'm not having this emergency force here between me and Israel, and I'm actually going to flood my troops into the Sinai. Well, of course, the Israelis are quite alarmed about this. And at the same time, he says, I'm also going to close the Straits of Tirana, which are at the head here of the Gulf of Aqaba. Now, obviously, it's quite vital for Israel's sea supply routes from the Red Sea that stays open. Now, in 1957, President Eisenhower had said, that is an act of war if you ever do that. Now, what causes the problem for Nasser is that when the UN emergency force is withdrawn, Hugh Thant, who's the Secretary General of the United Nations, says, well, in that case, it's not safe for our peacekeepers to stay in place on, down here at Sharm el-Sheikh, which people will be familiar with. And that, again, precipitates a bit of a crisis. The Americans say, well, we believe in freedom of navigation. What we'll do is put together an international coalition called Operation Regatta, and we will force those straits if we have to. Now, while that's coming together, the Israelis are getting very worried about overflights by Egyptian Air Force jets. They overfly some of the Israeli airfields. Most importantly, in May, they overfly Israel's nascent nuclear facility at Dimona in the Negev. And there is a specific flight on the 17th which really worries the Israelis. So there's a number of things coming together that make Israel think that there may be actually something coming our way.
And that's a really good point. Just to bring you in on that, Matthew, I mean, Israel would say to this day they needed to make a preemptive strike because not only are they surrounded by hostile neighbours, but there's a huge impact on their economy through the closure of the Strait of Tiran to Israeli shipping. You've got Nasser's troops in the Sinai Peninsula. They think, well, if we don't move first, they're going to move on us.
Oh, I push back a little bit on the ship. There's not a great deal of shipping that goes to the port of Eilat. Most Israeli shipping comes through to Israel itself. But it's a great casus belli. It's a big move diplomatically by the Egyptians, which forces...
It's symbolic, Matthew, isn't it?
The Israelis are basically being forced into saying we can't use our port. I'd come back to something that Chris said earlier. It's interesting that the Soviets, because the Soviets issue this disingenuous report that I think Nasser knows is not correct. But Nasser is forced into a war. And I think the point here is that the SixDay War is a war that neither side wanted. There's very poor brinkmanship on the part of Nasser as the Egyptian leader. And the Israelis were then waiting. And eventually they strike, feeling that what could happen is an attack on Israel itself. If they don't, because of their lack of strategic depth, push out and push the Egyptian forces back, then the Jordanians get involved and then the Syrians get involved. But of course, the bulk of Nasser's troops, the best part of his army is down in Yemen here. Yeah, thanks, Chris. Fighting in a civil war. So he doesn't have his best forces in the Sinai. They're not deployed primarily for an attack. They're primarily deployed for defence, and they fight well in situ. So both sides are misreading the other side, and Nasser makes a lot of very exaggerated anti-Semitic statements. A lot of these sort of propaganda statements against Israel are coming out of the Arab world. And Israel responds, listening to this propaganda, and launches on the 5th of June, the first attack.
I mean, we know now that the Egyptians and the Syrians were planning a preemptive strike on the 27th of May. And indeed, the Americans are picking up the signals for that. On the day before, the 26th, the United States President Johnson's team specifically warns Egypt, you know, if you're thinking about something, don't even think about it. And he then says to essentially his advisors, Israel will not have to go it alone as long as they don't go it alone. But most of his advisors push back and say, no, look, we have to help Israel if they get overwhelmed by this attack. But be in no doubt, the Egyptians were thinking about a preemptive strike on the 27th. And yet again, there was another flight over Israel's nuclear facilities the previous day. So they're very worried about their facility there. They're worried, as you say, about the build-up. They're also worried about statements now from Syria and Iraq. Iraq's involved in this as well, in a very tangential way. And meanwhile, King Hussein of Jordan is going, please, don't let this happen. I'm going to have to show solidarity
He
with
doesn't
my
really
brothers.
want to fight,
no, well,
but of course
does,
he ends up getting dragged into it, as
there's a momentum to this. The rhetoric and all the signalling goes completely wrong. It's an object lesson in how not to de-escalate a crisis, frankly.
Yeah, that's right. I think also something called the Syrian syndrome, and later on Moshe Dayan, the Israeli soldier and defence minister, he makes the point that there's an escalation on the Golan Heights that is partly from the Syrian side, is partly from the Israeli side, and there's an animosity there in the north that isn't present in the south with Egypt. And with King Hussein of Jordan, the Israelis actually have a fairly good relationship with Jordan, and King Hussein is sucked into the war, but he doesn't want to join the war, and the Israelis don't want to attack. So the problem starts in the north, and very poor diplomacy and brinkmanship leads to the Israelis launching their coup de main attack in June.
I think it's worth mentioning that if you look at the newspapers at the time in Egypt, there's this tremendous sense that they've been defeated twice, as Matthew outlined earlier. There's also the fact that you've got another agitating element here, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, that's founded in '64. It's not very strong by '67, but it is involved in both the propaganda around this, but also some of the direct action against Israel, the raids that have taken place from Syria, and in one occasion from Jordan as well. So they are a bit of a player.
Yeah.
But be in no doubt, the PLO is a tool. The Egyptians, the Jordanians and Syrians don't actually see them as big political players at this stage.
Well, there we go. That is some of the context of what is happening leading into the Six-Day War of 1967. Let's zoom in now and focus on those 6 days themselves. OK, now before we move on to the key moments of the Six-Day War, let's just have a look at some of the key statistics involved. Israel launched a preemptive strike, overwhelming the combined forces of Egypt, Jordan and Syria with advanced technology and superior strategy. Israel's armed forces included around 260,000 troops, 200 combat aircraft and 800 tanks, backed up by 300 artillery pieces. The Arab coalition had around 370,000 troops, 570 aircraft and over 1,800 tanks, but struggled with poor coordination and outdated technology. Casualties were heavy, with Israel suffering more than 700 deaths and over 2,500 wounded, while the Arab coalition faced even greater losses, with estimates of around 18,000 to 23,000 dead and tens of thousands wounded. Right, OK, we've got a new map in front of us now. This is of the Sinai Peninsula, and we're going to focus first of all on the first couple of days of the Six-Day War. And I think the first thing to point out about the Sinai Peninsula, this, as with everything in this part of the world, very historically and religiously significant, not least, of course, because you have in Sinai Mount Sinai, that of course is where Moses received the Ten Commandments. And just to give you a sense of the scale of the Sinai Peninsula, at its widest it's about 80 miles across, at its deepest it's about 250 miles across. Matthew, let's talk about what happened at the start of the Six-Day War and the preemptive strike that Israel launched. We've talked about their reasons for doing so. What form does their preemptive strike take?
Well, their preemptive strike takes out Egypt's air force. I mean, Egypt is the main protagonist on the Arab side. Once Egypt is knocked out, the Israelis have essentially beaten their main opponent. The key issue is air superiority and air power. You mentioned about the distance on the Sinai. The other point to make about the Sinai here is that it is desert. There is no top cover. There's no jungle. There's no need to remove top cover. Once you achieve air superiority and you've got command of the air, your forces can go out on the ground and you know that you've got complete cover up above. And at the start of the war, the Israelis launched this dramatic Operation Focus. They come in from the sea on either side, mostly from the Mediterranean. They surprise the Egyptians. The Egyptians have got their planes, their MiG-17s, 19s, their MiG-21s, which is their most advanced plane, the most advanced fighter plane, out on the apron on their airfields, and the Israelis come in and destroy the bulk of the Egyptian Air Force on the ground. Some Egyptian planes get up to fight the Israelis. The Israeli air technology, the planes they have mostly from France, are much better than the Soviet-supplied planes on the Egyptian side, and even in the air fights, the dog fights, the Israelis are triumphant there. Once that is achieved, the crushing of the Egyptian air defences, the ground battle can commence. And I would also say that similar air battles then happen with the Jordanians, also against the Iraqis, and in the north against the Syrians. And the Israelis are again successful in destroying those Arab air forces. So the key issue is air power. And once the air power has been achieved on the Israeli side, then you have the ground power of armour pushing out. So you move from the air to tanks.
And Chris, it is remarkable how badly protected the Egyptian Air Force was, because, I mean, it's basically just out there on these air bases in the desert. No radar, no air defences. I mean, they were sitting ducks almost.
Well, I mean, what's interesting about the whole situation here is the Jordanians have a really good radar, and they actually say to the Egyptians, there's a strike inbound on you. And the coordination is so poor on the Egyptian side that it never gets out to the airfields that they need to get their aircraft airborne or even to disperse them. There's a couple of issues that I think come out of this. Is the Israelis have been planning this for some time, that they might have to do this. Bear in mind that the Arabs and indeed the world haven't seen the Israelis do this sort of thing in the past. So it is actually a bit of a surprise. It's a bit like Pearl Harbor for the Americans in many ways. You know, they can't do it, surely. But what the Israelis have been doing is they've been practicing with their pilots and technicians to generate 4 sorties a day for each aircraft, whereas the average amongst the Arab countries is about 1.5, 2 a day. So their sortie rate is huge. And as Matthew says, it ends up with the Egyptian Air Force, 90% 335 aircraft destroyed, over 110 pilots killed as well. So it's not just the aircraft, it's the aircrew as well.
Which is truly remarkable. I mean, you mentioned Pearl Harbor. I suppose that is maybe the closest thing you could compare it to in terms of the kind of devastation caused by one attack.
Yeah, yes, indeed. And that, of course, is the intention. And once you've cleared the air, you know, with essentially a landscape that just looks like a parchment, anything that is exposed is then obviously vulnerable to air attack. And what the Egyptians have done is said, look, we know the Sinai. If we're going to be attacked, then we'll basically dig in along the major roads. And the key point about the Egyptians is that they're also primed for attack. They're not actually properly dug in. They don't have their artillery sighted. They don't have minefields in place. And the Israelis know that. So their whole plan, the Israelis, is to bypass these bastions, and that's a very Soviet concept, by the way, and actually employ maneuver warfare, movement and firepower together in order to get at the Egyptians.
And then, Matthew, am I not right in saying that then the Egyptians almost concede a kind of propaganda own goal by essentially selling what happens to their air forces as actually something of a military victory? So this gets misinterpreted by their ally Jordan.
Yes, they claim that they shot down scores of Israeli planes and that the Egyptian Air Force is on the attack. And this is a very mismanaged propaganda campaign that can only unfold badly for the Egyptians, because eventually the truth will come out and they can see that the Israelis are advancing. They can see that these pilots have been killed, as Chris was saying, and that the planes have been lost. So it's a very sort of short-term response. And, of course, the long-term effects on Nasser are catastrophic. He offers his resignation after the war, but the clamour is that he should stay in power. But his reputation is utterly damaged. It's by the war, but it's by this initial airstrike that means that everything that unfolds afterwards on the ground is possible because of this achievement of air superiority. And of course, it's much more technical, and the Israelis have got better planes supplied from the French. The Soviet supplied planes on the Egyptian side are less technically good. The Israeli pilots are much better trained. So in this very technologically heavy area of air power, this is the key edge that the Israelis have. Well, at one point also about Pearl Harbor, I mean, it's interesting that the Israelis coordinate the airstrike with then a devastating ground strike.
Yes.
Whereas the problem with Pearl Harbor is that the Japanese have a devastating airstrike and they still lose because they miss the aircraft carriers, they miss the fact that America can outproduce them. So this is an example in sort of military terms of how to do an operation to achieve a victory very, very quickly, very, very decisively.
I mean, the key thing is that the Israelis very quickly get sort of domination of the Egyptian will by threatening and encircling action. This is the key point about manoeuvre. You don't go for the frontal strength of an enemy, you go round it. And very early on, Field Marshal Amir, the head of the forces in Sinai, realises without air superiority on his side and the fact that the Israelis are being highly mobile around his formations, he actually gives up. He says, we're going home. And they start to retreat very early indeed. And then it becomes a who can get to the canal quickest before the Israelis get us.
But they get to the Suez Canal remarkably quickly.
Well, remember, it's about 80 miles. It's basically the distance between London and Cardiff. So you're basically going down the M4 across a desert. And that's how quickly you can get. And as the Israelis have done before, they get to the Suez Canal pretty quickly. And it's really totemic, because once you're at the Suez Canal, you're right in the guts of Egypt, Cairo, Alexandria. They all become sort of within range of your aviation and your artillery as well. One of the key things the Israelis wanted to achieve, the one airfield they didn't destroy was at Al Arish, because they wanted to use that themselves for operations further west afterwards. And you can see the drive down the coast there from Gaza through Rafah, all these places familiar today, to Al Arish.
Well, that's interesting, actually, because initially the Israelis are not quite sure how far they will go. And the unfolding victory means they push forward and they launch this latter phase, which takes them up to the Suez Canal. And it's interesting what Chris was saying about the symbolic, the totemic effect of the Suez Canal. Not only are the Israelis now right up close to these three major Egyptian cities, Suez, Ismailia and Port Said, but also the Suez Canal is a natural border, a natural defensive position. And the final point I'd make about the breaking of the Egyptian army and then this sauve-qui-peut where they retreat and flee back to the Suez Canal. I mean, it's a terrible experience for the Egyptian soldiers. I think that's just tribute to their bravery. They stood and fought for as long as they did without air cover. But the Israeli Air Force with air cover, of course, drops napalm on them as they're retreating. And in the next war in 1973, one of the part of the work that the Egyptian army does for its soldiers is to try and put in place, for instance, clothing that can resist napalm, because they saw the devastating effects of the Israeli air superiority on their retreating troops. The same thing happens up on the Syrian front, but it's very marked here in the Sinai. And Egyptian troops, short of water, short of food, on foot, are fleeing back to the canal once the Israelis, as Chris has said, using manoeuvre war, have broken through the fixed defences that the Egyptians have placed up close to the Israeli border. I mean, it's a terrible experience for the Egyptians. It's a searing experience not only for the Egyptian army and for the Egyptian military, but also, of course, for the Egyptian people and for Gamal Abdel Nasser.
And the third humiliation in a row, of course, after 1948, the Suez Crisis and this. So it's racking up. The other thing we should mention, I think, is a little seaborne attack on Sharm el-Sheikh by the Israelis. Really nice little operation. And of course, it totally distracts the Egyptians as well, the fact that this has taken place. So all along the front here, the Egyptian army is collapsing and they're unable to reinforce because of what's going on in the air.
And also, I mean, you were talking earlier, Chris, about the geopolitics, about the Cold War, about the Soviets and the Americans. This is a huge triumph by a country that will become a very close ally of America in the middle of the Vietnam War, a year before the Tet Offensive, when the Americans are doing very, very badly and they're going to lose the war in Vietnam. And here is an example of how to use military power. The soldiers love this. This is how the equipment should work. This is how manoeuvre warfare works. This is how air power should work. And it works perfectly. It works seamlessly for the Israelis. So for the Americans looking at this, this is a big draw. And after the 1967 war, America becomes, for instance, one of the main suppliers of Israeli military equipment. And the two countries tie together a lot more closely. Because I think one of the points that Chris might want to talk about is also much of the equipment that the Israelis are using. They do have some Centurions, they do have some American tanks, but much of the equipment, both in the air and on the ground, is French-supplied equipment, not American.
That's a really good point. Do you want to touch on that briefly, Chris?
That's absolutely right. I mean, they've got A4 Skyhawks as well as the Mirage 3s from the French. But the French have done a good job in supplying the Israelis. The Israelis have procured stuff from everywhere. They had a great experience of that during the 1948 war. They really had to scramble to get the equipment they needed. So their procurement is very agile indeed. So they'll get stuff from where they need it. Bear in mind, the Mirage 3 aircraft that they have persists into the Falklands War. The Argentinians have got Mirage 3s with very good Matra missiles at that point. So it's a very powerful aircraft and can be cycled through, as we said, up to 4 times a day. I think the other thing that's worth mentioning here is the fact that there was a discussion just before the war that if it went too badly, the Israelis might actually take their nascent nuclear device out into the Sinai and do a demonstration of its use.
Well, that would be a turn up for the books.
I spoke to a colonel who was in charge of the programme in the 1990s, a chap called Yitzhak Yacoub, and he said it was genuinely a plan, and we were sorting out technically whether we could do that. Small little device, not a big one, but and also obviously very primitive in those days because the programme didn't really get going for a while. So there was a possibility of them doing that. But on the American side, there was a real fear at this stage that the Egyptians shouldn't be humiliated too much because that would bring the Soviets in. I don't think that was the case. The Soviets weren't in a position to deploy forces in any great numbers at that stage, except by air, of course. But, the Americans are very concerned to contain this throughout. They're constantly saying, contain it, and trying to keep a hold of the Israelis, trying to, if you like, keep them on a leash.
Well, I'm sure we will come on to in due course. Could there have been a different set of circumstances in which the Americans and the Soviet Union actually intervene in the region in 1967 more directly? And the key point is, in the space of just a few days, Israel has massively expanded its territory. It now has control of the Sinai Peninsula. Also, we haven't mentioned it much, now has control of the Gaza Strip. But it's not just about Sinai and Gaza. Of course, they also managed to gain the West Bank, East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. So let's shift our focus now and look at the next few days. OK, now we have a new map before us now, and this focuses on what we're going to talk about now, which is the latter part of the Six-Day War, and in particular, the success that Israel had taking the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Old City and the Golan Heights. Matthew, to start with you, let's talk about what happens in Jerusalem, because Jordan and King Hussein, they feel compelled to join in this war effort, even though they don't necessarily want to, and so they start attacking Jerusalem.
Yes, I mean, just before the war starts, the King of Jordan, Hussein, signs a defence pact with Egypt, and the Egyptians send a commander to command the Jordanian army, which is actually rather good and has been trained by the British previously. And King Hussein is faced with a terrible choice. He either stays out of the war and loses his whole kingdom, or as happens, he joins the war and he loses the West Bank and Jerusalem, because for him to have stayed out of the war when the Egyptians were under such pressure from the Israelis, and when the Palestinian issue was to the fore, would have meant that he would have been seen in such a poor light.
And there would have been an internal revolt like in Egypt.
As indeed there was in September 1970. He had a lot of problems internally with the Palestinian people who'd been displaced and were living in Jordan. So he was drawn into a war. He was firing artillery over the border. The Israelis said to him, "We have no beef with you." The Israelis weren't looking to occupy East Jerusalem and the Holy City and the famous iconic Dome of the Rock and the Wailing Wall. They were drawn into the war because of initial attacks from Jordan. Then the Israelis attack. The key operation that most people remember is here at Jerusalem, where Israeli forces, they fight to the north through something called Ammunition Hill and Mount Scopus. They come down through the south through Government House, and they actually enter the old city from the rear through something called St. Stephen's Gate or Lion's Gate. And they come in and they go up. And there are the famous images of Israeli paratroopers who were leading this attack, taking the war into the Holy City, and they seize the Old City and the holy sites. And then subsequent to that, and Chris might want to talk more about this, the Israeli forces also then, because of the initial success, rather like in Sinai, the initial success then emboldens the troops to do more. They then occupy the whole of the West Bank up to the river here, the Jordan, that runs down to the Dead Sea. And this again provides them with some sort of a natural border. And of course, for the Israelis, this is high ground running north-south.
Yeah.
So they now have the high ground, which militarily makes them feel much stronger. And it means that the narrow portion of Israel here has now been considerably deepened to go all the way to the Jordan Valley. So in military terms, the Israelis now have strategic depth, they have the high ground, and in political, religious terms, they've seized the holy sites, and including the Wailing Wall, the most holy site for Jews.
Chris, do you want to pick up the story? Because in a way, it's almost a mirror image of what we've seen in Sinai, a remarkably quick expansion of Israeli territory.
Yeah, and you have to say that after the 48 war and the Suez crisis, there was quite a lot of talk in Israel about the need to actually either occupy or neutralise the West Bank. So this is an opportunity, if you like, for them to do it. And the Jordanians, frankly, have given them the excuse to take it over. Just notice Amman here, which is the Jordanian capital, of course, so that's quite vulnerable. So by coming forward to the Jordanian River, they effectively say to the Jordanians, do you want us to come further? Because if you do, keep going with your operations. And the Jordanians go, oh, perhaps we'll just settle where we are now and see what happens. The other problem is the Syrians. As you can see, they've got a number of brigades massed here in the north. The Israelis aren't sure what they're going to do, but there's a lot of genocidal language coming out of Damascus. They say, we're going to grind the Israeli settlements into dust, and we're going to pave the roads with Jewish skulls. And this is echoed by the Egyptians as well. So the Israelis are in no doubt about what's going to happen if they lose. And because of all this sort of belligerent language, and because the Golan is another very strategic region, these Golan Heights, two things associated with it. One is the topography, which gives you a commanding presence here in relation to Lebanon and Syria, but also there's water there. Quite a lot of water. Now, the Syrians and the Israelis in the past have not fought over the water, but just before the war, there were significant attempts by the Syrians to block the Israelis away from the water. So that is a big issue as part of the war aims of the Israeli government. And indeed, to neutralise these brigades and also to obviously occupy ground that actually is quite attractive to them, they drive in two axes, as you can see, south of the Sea of Galilee, that well-worn Crusader route, and also to the north here, supported by very heavy air attacks. And of course, the Syrians are overwhelmed in absolutely no time whatsoever.
And I suppose, Matthew, you can see why Israel would think, look, we've had a tremendous success in Sinai, we've had tremendous success in the West Bank, let's go for the hat-trick.
Well, it's sort of ironic that the war starts up on the Syrian front, but the Syrians are the least aggressive in terms of what happens as the war unfolds, because they don't really come to the aid of the Jordanians and the Egyptians. And at the end of the war, as Chris says, when the Israelis attack, it is in some measure an attack launched by Moshe Dayan, the Israeli defence minister, who's taking matters into his own hands. And again, it shows the fact that the Israelis were not planning all of these things. The war is unfolding and action is resulting because of previous action. And on the Golan Heights, again, it's a strategic area. And for the Israelis, they push up onto this basaltic plain and they occupy a line of tells, these volcanic plugs, along north-south on the plain, the heights. And they can look down towards Damascus. And also in the north, you have Mount Hermon as well, which gives a commanding view both towards Damascus and back towards Israel. So the seizure of the Golan Heights right at the end of the war is a final operation, in for a penny, in for a pound. And it's interesting, we were talking earlier about the Israeli spy Eli Cohen, who was hanged in Damascus before the war. But one of the stories I heard was that he said to the Syrian Defence Ministry, look, your troops are up on the Golan Heights. It's very, very hot. One of the things you might want to do is to plant trees, and I can arrange this, because he was pretending to be a Syrian businessman. And so he arranged for these trees to be planted at the Syrian defensive positions to give the men shade. But of course, as you can see, once the battle unfolds, the Israelis then can see perfectly where the Syrian positions are, because they just have to go for the trees, because this is
which is great for napalm as well, of course.
Yeah. So it's sort of an example of a long-term Israeli spy operation, and it makes you think about what Mossad was doing beforehand in terms of getting information on the enemy order of deployment. And more recently, we've seen in Lebanon with Hezbollah some of these hush-hush operations that also go along with what we're looking at on the map here, which is troops deploying for battle.
And Chris, we probably should mention, I mean, we've spoken a lot about Syria and Jordan and Egypt. Iraq does have an involvement here, because they go after the Israelis go after an airbase in Iraq.
Yes, they do. The Iraqis predominantly put in intelligence and also air power into this. Not very much, but just to keep the Iraqis quiet, they do go and devastate an airfield in Iraq. And the Iraqis go, yeah, I think we're not going to win in this war, so we're not going to persist anymore. I think at this part of the proceedings, we need to mention the USS Liberty, which is an intelligence ship that is sitting off the north coast of Sinai in international waters. So it's going about its normal business. It's actually listening to what's going on. It's getting all the signals intelligence from both sides. And it is then attacked by Israeli air and sea forces. And to this day, there is a disputed debate as to whether it was deliberately attacked, whether it was misidentified, whether there was some sort of way in which the Israelis were trying to disguise what they were going to do, either up here or in relation to the West Bank. Now, my own view is I'm a great believer in the cock-up theory of history rather than the conspiracy theory. And I think they overflew it early one morning. They identified it. The pilots came back and said, well, it's a US ship. There's no question about that. And then later on, there was an attack by small fast attack craft and also by aircraft that seriously damaged the ship, but also killed a number of sailors and injured about 100 more. And so to this day, nobody seems to know whether it was deliberate to shield what was going on in the north here, or indeed it was a mistake, blue on blue mistake.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I think that the Liberty fiasco was the subject of a very good book, and it follows the line that Chris was taking, that really it was a mistake, one of those fog of war incidents, and I think that is the correct answer. But I was told by an American DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency officer, that the Israelis did know it was an American ship, and the Israelis attacked nevertheless because they were worried that the ship here off the north coast of Sinai was monitoring the Israeli movement across the Sinai, and the Israelis were fearful that the Americans, through the intelligence that was coming from the ship, would then put pressure on the Israelis not to go all the way to the Suez Canal, not to humiliate Nasser, not to occupy the whole of the Sinai, as Chris was saying earlier, to put some brakes on the Israeli operation. And the Israelis were so determined to get to the Suez Canal that they made the decision, knowing that the ship was an American ship, to attack it nevertheless, which shows what happens in war, but also the ruthlessness of the operation, and also the relationship between Israel and America, where the Israelis thought able to do this. And afterwards there was some moves towards the Americans to launch an attack on the Israeli airfields from which the planes had taken off to attack the ship, which never happened. And of course, after the SixDay War, America and Israel became very close allies. But it's a very interesting episode, and I do tend towards what Chris has said, but I was mindful of what I was told from the horse's mouth of the American defence establishment, this officer telling me, well, no, they did know, and they attacked nonetheless.
But I think what we cannot lose sight of is just how quickly Israel managed to achieve a stunning military victory, a very famous military victory. Remember, it's less than 20 years since the state was founded, and also expand their territory at the same time. The Syrians agreed to a ceasefire on the 10th of June 1967. So in just 6 days, and this is a time when you've got the Americans bogged down in Vietnam for years and years and years, in just 6 days they have achieved a stunning military victory. That's the real history of what happened during the Six-Day War. Now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. OK, now let's discuss what might have happened had the Six-Day War played out differently. What might the world look like today? I mean, first of all, Matthew, could the Six-Day War have played out differently? I suppose we should say, was it inevitable that it was going to happen? Was there going to be a conflict at some point between Israel and its Arab neighbours?
No, I'm not sure that there was a conflict that was inevitably going to happen. I think it was a result of poor brinkmanship. I think it was a result of the Israelis having something of a trigger finger. No, I don't think the war was inevitable. I mean, one of the consequences of the war is it doesn't resolve the political issue of the status of the Palestinians and the status of Israel and the legitimacy of Israel in the region. So the war seems to be, in the short to medium term, a very successful conflict. But of course, in 1973, there's another war because the conflict is not resolved. And then there's an intifada and there's a war in Lebanon. So this does carry on. In terms of the counterfactuals, in terms of how the war might have unfolded if things had gone differently, it's difficult. The Israelis had so much superiority in the air and they were so much more advanced technologically that even if they'd missed the Egyptian Air Force on the ground, I think that the Israeli Air Force would have won in the air. It might have taken them slightly longer. So I think that the operation would have unfolded in a similar way.
Even had the Egyptians, say, better protected their aircraft, had better radar, better air defences, even so, it may have limited the damage, but you still think they get defeated?
Well, no, the way you put it there, James, is a fair point, that the Israelis might have only pushed some distance into the Sinai if the Egyptians had managed to maintain some air cover for their troops so that the troops weren't forced to flee back to the Sinai under the pressure
from the Israelis.
So they don't get to the Suez,
say.
Exactly. And, I mean, in that case, the war could have ended up with the Israelis some distance into the Sinai. If the Egyptians had a better air force and had been able to achieve air dominance, then, I mean, you could well have seen an invasion of Israel and the destruction of the Israeli state, and that would have had a different outcome in terms of geopolitics, because in terms of the Cold War, America would have intervened, I think, at that point. So,
Chris, what about you? How do you think the war could have played out differently?
Well, I think the problem is that if the Egyptians just hold here, and the main attack on Israel comes from Jordan and Syria, there's enough forces there to disrupt Israeli society. And we talked about the lack of strategic depth that the Israelis have at that point. There is actually, if there had been a coordinated attack, it would have been very difficult for the Israelis to deal with that. There's no question. the best key to any victory for the Arab side would have been the preemptive strike on the 27th of May. If they'd have achieved that, I think Israel would have been severely disrupted. I think there would have been penetrations by the Syrian and the Jordanian army, had they chosen to do so. That would have been sufficient to disrupt the state to the extent that it couldn't actually continue fighting the way it wanted to. You'd have been back to the 1948 situation, where they were scrambling to defend on a number of different fronts. For me, the key issue is that airstrike. Now, would it have happened another time later? Well, the fact of life is the Arab nations were arming very, very quickly at this point, with Soviet equipment in particular. And one of the worries of the Americans at the time is that if the Israelis felt totally overwhelmed in terms of threat, then either they would do a preemptive strike anyway, or they would develop a nuclear device, which indeed they were doing at the time. But more importantly, they might use it. And so there's a balance here to be struck with keeping Israel feeling safe, but not allowing it to go forward and be so aggressive that it destabilizes the regime. A lot of parallels with what's going on with American policy with Taiwan at the moment.
Yeah, well, I suppose the interesting point there is, of course, if China were to move on Taiwan, do the US get involved? And if the Arab states were to make a preemptive strike on Israel in 1967, do the US get involved?
Well, yeah, I think the US would have got involved.
Well, they said on the 26th of May, if you do what we think you're going to do, your preemptive strike.
And you think they would have
Israel,
followed through on that?
Oh yeah, I mean,
despite being involved in Vietnam.
Yeah, they've got a massive naval force in the Eastern Mediterranean with the Sixth Fleet. They're absolutely capable of actually doing quite a lot of damage to Israel, to Egypt and also Syria as well. And I think the level of sophistication in the American forces at that time would have been quite decisive. I think the key point again is going back to the geography. Is at what point do you react? There is not a lot of space here. Once Israel's penetrated, it's very difficult. You saw how destabilized Israel became on the morning of the 7th of October 2023. It took a while for the forces to react. It was Yom Kippur, it was a public holiday, obviously. But the fact of life is, once you're on the soil of Israel, you are very, very vulnerable as Israelis to what's going on, because it not only disrupts your society, any attack on Israel has to be pushed back as soon as possible, and you have to fight on other people's country. It was an absolute article of faith amongst the Israelis in their military doctrine and their political philosophy that after 1948 we always fight on our neighbours' territory.
I might pick up on something else there, which is, of course, mobilisation has a big impact on Israel in terms of its economy, because you have people who are reservists drawn back into the army. So your pharmacists and your nurses and your plumbers and stuff are no longer there. The other thing I pick up on is something Chris said earlier about coordination. The Egyptians, the Jordanians and Syrians don't coordinate in any meaningful way. They do coordinate in 1973 when they attack again on Yom Kippur in October 1973. And in the 1973 war, when the Egyptians and the Syrians coordinate, they have initial success, but they are again pushed back by the Israelis, and they end up with something of a political victory, but also something of a military defeat on the Arab side. So, I mean, the point I would make that even when they coordinate, the Israelis are militarily so strong that they still managed to defeat a coordinated attack. And in 1967, the Egyptians were on the back foot. They weren't coordinating what was happening with the Jordanians and Syrians. They were reacting, they weren't proactive.
One of the things that's really interesting about the way Israeli military doctrine develops is they never seek to perfect the last day of the previous war. They're always looking to perfect the first day of the next one.
Yeah.
And time again, right up until the present day, you're seeing the Israelis coming out with very innovative tactics and strategy to be able to deal with their opponents. And of course, they're surrounded by potentially hostile states. And so they have to be on the front line all the time. They're constantly refreshing their doctrine, their technology and their concepts. And essentially, the Israeli Defence Force is a learning organisation.
Is there any way, Matthew, that this could have escalated into a major conflict between the US and the Soviet Union? I mean, do you think the Soviets, had there been a preemptive strike, let's say, by Egypt on Israel, the US then get involved in defence of Israel, do the Soviets then get involved?
Well, I think at the highest level, the Soviets, the Americans, they talk to each other in whispers. So they're understood, they understand what each other is doing. And in 1973, when there is almost an escalation because of the Israelis pushing over the Suez Canal towards Cairo, the Americans send a signal to the Israelis by launching something called DEFCON 3, Defence Condition 3, putting their forces on a ready state of nuclear alert to send a signal to the Israelis, look, you need to stop. So there's a lot of signalling that goes on, very much part of international politics. And the Soviets and the Americans, as you saw also with the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early 60s, they were well adept at lowering the tone of what was happening, de-escalating. So the problem was, on the ground, the Egyptians and the Israelis and the Syrians, certainly in 1973, involved in this desperate war. It was much harder for the Soviets and the Americans to put pressure on their proxies, their allies. But they do this. So my view is that it wouldn't have escalated, no. The Americans and the Soviets would have worked together to de-escalate. And we often don't hear or see these things because, as I say, they're done behind the scenes.
It's the dog that barks in the night.
The result is peace, or the result is there isn't any escalation.
I think it's worth considering, James, what would have happened if they prevailed in 1967, the Arabs, because all the rhetoric coming out of Egypt, Syria and Iraq was all about annihilating the Jews and actually rubbing out Israel from the map. So what would have happened if that had been the case?
Well, let's play that out. So let's say there is no state of Israel as a result of the Six-Day War. It's a decisive victory for the Arab states, as unlikely as that may well have been. I mean, the modern world would look completely different.
I'm not sure. I think it would have been very difficult to eradicate the idea of Israel, the homeland for the Jews. And I think, as we said, I think the Americans would have come in very early, to tell you the truth. But the fact of life is, if Israel had been pushed back, in fact, probably to its 1948 borders, for example, and then the tripartite agreement that between France, Britain and America come back into play again as guarantors, you might have seen a stabilisation on that basis. Highly unlikely, because I'm afraid to say, as I said, with all the rhetoric, it was extremely genocidal in terms of getting rid of Jews in particular. That was the issue, not just Israel itself. But what's interesting is, if that happens, I think the PLO just evaporates, because these big players here, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, are going to have the say on what's happening in the territory. And so, the PLO has nowhere to go in those circumstances.
Well, this brings us on to some of the really big long-term consequences of what if the Six-Day War had been lost by Israel, or what if it had turned out differently. And we should say, obviously, that we're recording this in the week in which a ceasefire deal has been agreed between Hamas and Israel in Gaza. And so this is highly relevant. And I mean, Matthew, what would the Palestinian cause look like today had this played out differently?
I mean, the elephant in the room talking about the war is the status of the Palestinians. Chris made good points about what could have happened to the Jewish state. The question is, what's happening to the Palestinians? Interestingly, the result of Nasser's humiliation, the defeat in the 67 war, is a big boost in Palestinian nationalism, which of course is not what the Israelis want, but that's the unintended effect of their victory. And you see all these terror attacks in the 1970s on planes,
Munich Olympics,
all as a result of the Palestinians pushing their cause. So, I mean, one of the points with the Six-Day War is it's a military victory, but in a long-term sense, you still have a political defeat, because you've got this ongoing issue now of the Palestinians and what would the Palestinian state look like. And it's interesting because Chris was saying about the reoccupation of the West Bank. If the Arabs had done better in the 1967 war, would they have formed a Palestinian state? I'm not sure they would have done. It's a counterweight in the region. It's possibly a threat. So the issue of the Palestinians rumbles on.
I think the issue is, James and Matthew, is that if there had been partial success by the Arabs, you're essentially looking at the Palestinians being federated with the Jordanians. If you look at the demographics on the ground, that becomes a federated state, if you like. And if you look in Jordan today, there's huge numbers of Palestinians actually live there. And so it seems to me that would have happened. These big players wouldn't have tolerated the PLO as a separate political organisation. And they would have been absorbed, I think, the Palestinians within the Jordanian Egyptian societies. And quite a lot of them actually came from Egypt and Jordan originally. So there's all sorts of things that play out there. And I do wonder whether, as I said, if Israel is able to hold its real prime territory under the 1948 boundaries, whether it settles down, actually, and the crisis is guaranteed by outside powers.
But you both, by the sounds of it, agree that even had the Six-Day War been lost by Israel or gone differently and been less disastrous for the Arab states, you still don't think there would be a formal Palestinian state today?
I mean, that's a big historical counterfactual. Yes, I mean, the idea for the Palestinian movement was that it would have a Palestine in what Israel looks like today, minus the Golan Heights. That was the aim of the Palestinian movement from the early 20th century, but certainly from the 1960s
but
onwards.
Probably not achievable. I mean, there aren't linear lines, if you like, to see that happening. I genuinely believe that if the Arabs had been successful and hadn't lost the war, and Jordan hadn't lost the West Bank, the Palestinian movement would have fizzled out, because I think the political pieces would have been too big for them to operate in that space on the Arab side.
I think Palestinian identity was there, and I think that Palestinian nationalism was well enough formed by the 60s that it would have carried on. But I mean, you can see today it has done. One of the arguments that is partly because of Israel, the resistance to Israel builds up an identity, but I think the identity was already there. And if it's a two-state solution or a one-state solution, something needs to be done about the issue of the Palestinians, and the Six-Day War ends up giving a military solution to a political problem.
I think the other thing about the PLO one has to sort of understand, I think in the 60s, is essentially an agent of the Russians, the Soviets. And it's being steered very carefully towards Soviet interests in the Middle East. So quite a lot of that backing probably disappears if the Americans had intervened to help the Israelis.
Can I ask a few questions about the things that happened in the decade after the Six-Day War? First of all, the Yom Kippur War, 1973, doesn't happen if the Six-Day War is lost by Israel or goes differently?
Well, obviously not. I mean, the 73 war flows from the 1967 war, and it flows from the fact that there's no political solution, partly to the Palestinians, but more for the Egyptians and the Syrians, also the fact that they've had territory taken and they want the territory back.
And they're better armed. Yeah,
and the 73 war is quite interesting militarily because the Soviets supply the Egyptians and the Syrians with anti-tank and anti-aircraft systems that blunt, certainly initially, what the Israelis have in terms of superiority in the air and in terms of their better tanks. So, I mean, the 73 war flows from the 67 war. And then, of course, from the 73 war, there is a peace treaty in 1979 between Egypt and Israel, which is the
Camp
first...
David Accords and everything. And that presumably wouldn't happen either.
No. It wouldn't. That wouldn't have been necessary. But I mean, the Camp David Accords then bring peace between Israel and Egypt, and then from that, there's then a peace treaty between Jordan and Israel.
And return the Sinai to Egypt.
They do, and then there's a kind of a buffer force put into the Sinai as well, and there's a treaty that works. But the problem with the Palestinians rumbles on because then in the late 1980s you have the first Intifada. So that problem is not resolved. And then, of course, what we see today is the problem carrying on with Hezbollah supporting what's happening with the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. So, I mean, the 67 war doesn't resolve the fundamental issues.
Well, let's look at other things that happen in the region or could happen in the region as a result. I mean, what happens in Syria, for example, because you do get the rise of the Assad dynasty at the start of the 1970s. Is there even a knock-on impact on Iran? I mean, you've still got the Shah in control at this point.
I think in terms of the 67 war, it's quite limited. What is interesting is that King Hussein gets the message that actually my best option here is to stay on the right side of Israel. It doesn't stop him, later in 1973 sort of having another go, but it's part of the progression of Jordan saying, if I stay neutral in this, Israel feels safe, then I'm going to feel safe as well, and the dynasty continues. What's really interesting about this region, to my mind, is when you've got Egypt and Syria basically putting the pressure on Israel, it's very difficult. And let's go back to the Crusades again. When Saladin was able to unite the resources of Egypt and Syria, and where bits of Jordan are now, that was the period of greatest threat for the Crusaders. And of course, resulted in the Battle of Hattin in 1187. And Israel constantly has to bear in mind that there's a possibility that that comes back again. And you get crushed between the vice jaws of Egypt and Syria. And right now, we've got obviously quite an unstable situation in Syria. Egypt is on side, of course, with peace. But the dynamics of the region, if they turn again, make it very difficult for Israel if those two big countries suddenly decide they want to confront Israel. Iran, I don't think there was much rock over into what's happening in the Iranian regime. We've got to remember this is predominantly a Sunni region. You've got obviously the Alawites in Syria, but predominantly Sunni. Iran is Shiite, of course, and they've got interests in Yemen and more broadly under the Shah in the Indian Ocean as well. If you look at the destroyers that the Shah acquired from the Americans, the Spruance class in the 1970s, they are designed for ocean warfare. So Iran is pointing into the Indian Ocean that way as a means of dominating this region. So they're slightly off centre in this. This remains a cockpit here for these players here. There's no question about that.
You mentioned the Battle of Hattin. We should just say we did an episode all about the Battle of Hattin in 1187 during the Crusades a few weeks ago, so go and check that out if you haven't seen it already. Matthew, to give you the final thought, had the 1967 war played out differently, does this remain one of the world's most conflicted regions?
I think that there's perhaps an over-focus on the Middle East. There are other conflict zones around the world. There are reasons why people are interested in the region, partly for religious, historical significance. But I would say that the final point is that ultimately what leads to peace and takes a region out of conflict is diplomacy and political agreement and not war. And I think too often, too many parties in the region turn to their trigger finger when what they should be looking at is a diplomatic solution, working out what the key fundamental political issues are.
Just one little but on that is if you totally annihilate your enemy, you don't need diplomacy. And this is heavily in the Arab mind at this point. So they're thinking the solution here is a military one. If you think about it with Germany and Japan, they were utterly defeated militarily, so the political solution could be put in place. And there's this constant itch amongst politicians that if only we can actually decisively defeat our enemy, we can then impose a political solution as well. And this recurs throughout history. And there's a lot of that on the ground here, thinking that, you know, if we can just crush Israel, we can impose whatever we like.
I think also on the other side, I think if you crush the Palestinians, it will work, and it doesn't work. And if you crush the Israelis, it doesn't work. I think people need to come to a modus vivendi and maybe pull back from the military option and think about other ways of resolving the fundamental problems. And I think there are people in the region, in Syria, in Jordan, in Egypt, in Israel, who want to do this. And what the 67 war shows is, you know, too often the military solution seems to be the easy one, and in the long run, it doesn't give you what you want.
Well, there we go. We could discuss this for hours, but gentlemen, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. But I think what we can say is that the Six-Day War, stunning, decisive military victory though it was for Israel, probably could have played out differently. Either have been less of a decisive victory had, for example, the Egyptian Air Force been better defended, the radar, the air defences been better in the Sinai Peninsula, and potentially had the Six-Day War been lost by Israel, there could have been some huge long-term consequences for the region. What does it mean for the state of Israel itself? Remember, Israel, a very young country at this point, less than 20 years old. Does it continue to exist? Probably yes, but maybe with very different borders to today. Had Israel not captured the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, then clearly the geography of the region incredibly different. What does it mean as well for the Cold War? Remember, this is 1967. You've got the Americans engaged in Vietnam. Would they have got involved had, for instance, NASA launched a preemptive strike on Israel? Almost certainly. Would that then have dragged the Soviet Union into the conflict? Maybe less likely. Maybe there'd have been some kind of de-escalation, a bit like we saw during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But what would the Middle East look like today? And what would the impact have been on the Palestinians? Would Palestinian nationalism continue to bubble up? Would we have seen the 1973 Yom Kippur War? Would we have had the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel in 1978 and the peace agreements in 1979? Some really big, long-term questions, all stemming from 6 days in 1967. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today, but my thanks to Matthew and Chris for joining me, and we'll be back undoing more battles from history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Undone, on YouTube. And you can also listen to the show wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye. Goodbye.